Secondly, the first 10 verses, as I said, are about God's king revealed. The next 3 chapters are God's king rebelled against. And it's really serious. In chapter 11, God presents his king's messenger and message rejected. They reject Christ, and they reject what he says when we get there. And that's why it's interesting that in chapter 11, it ends with Jesus saying, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, I'll give you rest." He says, "Only those of you that love me will come to me. The rest," he says, "are rejecting me. But if you're weary and heavy laden, come to me. I'll give you rest." Chapter 12, he's attacked personally. That's where they accuse him of being demon-possessed and all that. Chapter 13, he starts, and what Jesus does is he's rejected, and by chapter 12, he actually withdraws from speaking plainly to the people, and he starts going in this mystery phase. And he starts talking about stuff, and the disciples go, "How come you're talking like that?" And he says, "Because I'm only going to speak in mysteries," because he says they don't understand. They're blind. They're hard-hearted. They're not listening. Now, the third major division is God's king retreating with his apostles. And what Jesus does is he first goes out, presents himself, just goes with the crowds. They reject him. And so he pulls back, confronts the religious leaders. They reject him. And so then he pulls in close to his disciples and starts focusing his ministry on them because they're going to take the word out. So in chapter 14, God presents his king's compassion. First of all, he shows that in the death of John the Baptist, his tenderness there, how he feeds the 5,000. Remember, he's out in the woods, and they're coming out to him in the wilderness. And he feeds them out there, showing his compassion. Remember, the apostle says, "Don't feed them." And Jesus said, "No, we'll feed them." And then it climaxes in chapter 14 with Jesus walking on the Sea of Galilee, in the storm, and he's walking across the water. And it's interesting, the gospel writers say that as his feet touch, he's just walking just right on the top of the water, and I can just see where his feet touch, it just gets perfectly calm. And he's going to walk right by the boat. Isn't that interesting? The gospel writers add that. He wasn't going to stop. He wanted to see if they were watching and needed him. And they did. They were screaming and crying. He comes in and calms the sea and takes them home. Chapter 15, God presents his king's convictions. He talks about internal defilement. He talks about his calling to the Jews first, and then he feeds the 4,000. In chapter 16, another fill in the blank, God presents his king by a confession of his deity. And Peter says, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And then he kind of looks around and goes, "Wow, where'd that come from?" And Jesus said, "It's not from you. My Father told you to say that, and that's why you said it." But a confession of his deity. Chapter 17, the king is presented by a glimpse of his glory, and we know that from the Transfiguration. It's just very, very... in chapter 16, we have the first mention of the cross, as you see there. The second mention is in chapter 17. After his glory, he talks about the cross. Chapter 18, the king's humility. He says, "You have to come in childlike faith to me." He's so humble, he goes after the one and leaves the 99. And there's a lot of real touching stories there, especially about forgiveness. And the Lord says that if you're not willing to forgive, then you won't be forgiven. And for Christians, the application of that is that when we're unforgiving, one, we're not acting like a believer, but number two, God says that he's going to send us the torturers, he calls. That means that we're going to be afflicted because Christians are characterized by forgiving. And that's what chapter 18 is about. Chapter 19, God presents his king by his absolute authority. His authority in word, in the way, and in giving out of rewards. And it's a very interesting chapter when he talks, if you remember, the way to heaven, and people come to him and they say, "Can we go to heaven?" And he says, "No, you have to submit to me. You can't get there any other way." And he says, I'm the authority of all who come to me. Chapter 20, he's the king. God presents his king's position. In chapter 20, he's talked about being the judge. He's talking about being the Son of God and also the Messiah. And this is the last time he mentions the cross in chapter 20. Then, the next major section, the fourth division, is God's king is rejected and slain. And that's 21 to 27. Chapter 21, he offers himself. That's the triumphal entry. Chapter 22, he presents his kingly answers, or he presents his answers as king, answering the skeptics. He talks to them about heaven, about money, about the law, how to interpret it, who's going to heaven. Chapter 23, he rebukes the religious establishment. Chapter 24, he reveals the future. And I'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. Chapter 26, he's preparing to die. Chapter 27, he's offering his life on the cross. Finally, in the last section, God's king is raised from the dead, and he's presented as conquering death.